let's discuss tabbed apps. The tabbed app in iOS is a design classic. Everyone recognizes an app that has this list of icons at the bottom, and when you click it, it changes the current view controller. Now, here's a word of warning. If you are designing for Android, this is a bad design pattern. Why? Because in Android, you have your back, home, and sort of option buttons or task switcher below these tabbed things, and having buttons that close to each other is simply bad user experience because they could tap the wrong one. So don't do this in Android. That's just a side note. Right. So let's look at the basics of a tabbed app by actually opening up a new solution in Xamarin and clicking Tabbed App. Chances are you're going to use a tabbed app quite often in your development career, more so than most of the others. Hit Next. Let's have Dummy 3. And I've spelt it wrong, but it doesn't matter. Let's go ahead and create it. Then open up our storyboard as usual. Zoom out. The first thing you'll notice, our entry point is this thing called a tab bar controller. And this inherits from the class of UI tab bar controller. Then this item allows you to spawn various numbers of tabs. So every time you drag in a new view controller, it spawns a new tab for you. So we have a first view up at the top, and at the bottom we have a second view. And it appears Xamarin has a slight bug here in its display. The tab bar controller on the left is only showing one tab bar, but nonetheless, let's carry on. We're going to add another tab to this. Let's scroll down in our toolbox, grab a view controller, and drag it in. Now that we have that, what we can do is hold down Control, click in Tab Bar, and drag it over to the new view controller and release. It'll ask you for a relationship, and because we're dragging from a Tab Bar controller, we can have another tab. So when you hit Tab, it'll wire everything up for us. So let me just zoom in on this Tab Bar controller, and now we've had the second one actually appear on this. So the bug has gone away by itself, which is very handy. So we now have a first view, a second view, and a third view. Let's go ahead and run this in our iPhone 5, and this should behave exactly as you might be expecting. So we have our first view. When we click our tab, we have a second and the third one. And these all work as you expect. Right, stop that running. And I'm going to give you a gotcha for beginners to iOS. Inside of here, we have a view controller. Let's say you're on the first page. Then you click something in the first page that you want to read details on. But you cannot present a view controller on top of this first view without an underlying navigation controller. So if I just delete actually this third one, so just select it and hit backspace, scroll up in your toolbox and drag in a nav controller. And there's not much space to work with here, so I'll just zoom out. We now have an attached view controller to a navigation controller. Then what we should do is control click and drag from the tab controller to the nav controller and select tab. So now we have a navigation controller that allows us to further put view controllers on top of this one. And that's a good design pattern. It helps your user know where they are from the tab section, and then if they navigate away within that tab, up at the top there'll be a back button allowing them to go back within that tab. So it's quite an intuitive way of thinking about things and navigating. Now, where would you use one of these tab controllers? Well, you'd use it where you have an app that a user accesses things quite often. So if you had a music app, you would have something like a tab for favorites, a tab for new, a tab for messages if you had messaging in the app. And these would be three things that you'd expect the user to use quite often. So you don't want them clicking a menu, going to messages, because it's a long-winded way of doing things, and a tab is a nice shortcut. The downside of a tab controller is that you lose a bit of screen real estate at the bottom. And if you have a navigation controller, you also lose some screen real estate at the top, where you have your nav bar. Nowadays, with the larger screens of the iPhone 5, 6, etc., it's not such a problem. In the days of iPhone 4 and 4S, it was a problem, because if you then added a banner ad into this, you leave yourself with very little room to actually show content. So just be aware of that. That concludes how to make a tabbed app in Xamarin and some of the navigation controller gotchas, and also how to add a new tab to your controller.